This is a true story, something that happened in the final years of my life. I'm telling it because some betrayals are so profound, they deserve to be etched into memory, if only to serve as a warning. It all started in my own library, the room where I'd signed the contracts that built an empire, the very room where that empire would be stolen from me. The leather-bound will sat on the polished mahogany desk between us, its weight in the silence far heavier than its few ounces of paper and ink. My 3 children, Richard, Caroline, and Michael, stared at it, their faces a perfect, unholy trinity of feigned sympathy and barely concealed greed as my lawyer, a man I'd known for 40 years, cleared his throat and told them I was leaving everything to charity. That's when my eldest, Richard, smiled a serpent's smile and slid a different folder across the desk. "That won't be necessary, Father," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "According to this power of attorney, which you signed last month, we've already taken control of all assets. You're not of sound mind, you see. We're just protecting you from yourself. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." It had only been 6 months since I'd buried Eleanor, my wife of 52 years. The grief was a physical presence, a cold phantom that sat beside me in our cavernous Greenwich, Connecticut home. It shadowed me through the gardens she had so meticulously curated and stood behind me in the library as I stared out at the Long Island Sound. She was the architect of our life, while I was merely the builder. I had hammered and forged a construction empire, Vance Holdings, out of sheer grit and 2 strong hands, but she had turned our success into a home, a family, a legacy. Without her, the legacy felt like a hollow monument, and I, its lonely caretaker. My children saw my grief not as a wound to be tended, but as a crack in the fortress walls, an opportunity. Richard, my firstborn, had her eyes but none of her warmth. He saw the company as his birthright, a kingdom he was owed without ever having to fight a single battle. Caroline, my only daughter, was a ghost in our house, quiet and observant, but her stillness was the coiled poise of a viper. And Michael, the youngest, was a ship without a rudder, loyal only to the strongest tide, which had always been his older siblings. I was their father, the man who gave them everything, but in their eyes, I had become an obstacle. An old lion, toothless and tired, guarding a kill they believed was rightfully theirs. They began their campaign with whispers, cloaked in the language of concern. "Father, you're not sleeping. You forgot to eat yesterday. We're worried you're not taking care of yourself." They hired a private nurse, a stern woman named Ms. Albright, who monitored my medication with unnerving precision. After a minor health scare, a bout of arrhythmia they blew into a near-fatal coronary event, they insisted on a hospital stay. That's where it must have happened. In the sanitized haze of a private room at Stamford Hospital, buoyed by sedatives, I'd signed papers they'd put in front of me. "Just hospital consent forms, Dad," Michael had murmured, his hand patting my arm with a tenderness that now feels obscene. I was a builder. I knew how to read a blueprint, how to spot a fatal flaw in a steel beam from 100 yards away. But I had never learned to see the rot in my own foundation. The lawyer, a man I had once considered a friend, couldn't even look me in the eye. He packed his briefcase with the brisk, impersonal movements of a mortician. "It's ironclad, Elias," he'd said, his voice low. "The psychiatric evaluation they commissioned claims your grief has manifested as diminished capacity. It gives them full authority." My own children had declared me insane. The betrayal was so audacious, so complete, that it was almost sublime in its cruelty. They didn't just want my money, they wanted to erase me, to render me a non-person, a ghost in my own life while they lived it for me. That evening, they moved me out. There was no argument, no dramatic confrontation. It was all handled with a chilling, sterile efficiency. Richard supervised 2 movers as they packed a single suitcase for me. Not from my bedroom, but from a guest room, as if I were already a visitor who had overstayed his welcome. Caroline stood by the door, her arms crossed, directing them. "Just the essentials," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "He won't need much where he's going." The place they took me was called The Willows, a so-called luxury assisted living facility in a leafy suburb just over the New York border. It was a 5-star prison, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive architecture with tastefully upholstered chairs, discreetly placed handrails, and the faint, cloying scent of lavender and despair. My room overlooked a perfectly manicured lawn where other ghosts like me were gently encouraged to take the air. I was stripped of my phone, my wallet, my watch, the Patek Philippe Eleanor had given me on our 30th anniversary. For safekeeping, Michael explained, his gaze skittering away from mine. We'll manage everything for you now. In those first weeks, I was numb. I sat by the window, watching the seasons turn, a prisoner of my own legacy. They had done their work well. My calls were monitored. My few visitors were old friends of theirs, sent to pat my hand and report back on my docile decline. They were systematically dismantling my world. They sold my classic cars, liquidated stock portfolios, and I heard them discussing putting the Greenwich house on the market. They were gutting my life for parts, and they did it with the righteous air of children performing a sad but necessary duty. The true turning point, the moment the grief in my heart finally hardened into something cold and sharp, came on a Tuesday. They had come for their weekly visit, a performative ritual to maintain the illusion of a caring family. They sat across from me in the sterile common room, speaking to me in the slow, patronizing tones one reserves for a child or a simpleton. Believing I had drifted off, they began to talk amongst themselves. The board meeting was a breeze, Richard said with a smug chuckle. They bought the story about your graceful retirement hook, line, and sinker. Caroline added, did you see his face when he realized? For a second, I thought the old man might actually have another heart attack. It would have been more convenient. But it was Michael's words that lit the fuse. He laughed, a high, reedy sound. He's so lost without Mom. He'll sign anything we put in front of him. It was almost too easy. The casual, dismissive cruelty of it. They weren't just stealing from me. They were mocking my love for their mother, using my deepest pain as their primary tool. In that moment, the grief didn't vanish, but it transmuted. The sorrow that had clouded my mind for months burned away, leaving behind a pure, crystalline rage. The old lion wasn't dead. He had just been sleeping. And they had made the fatal mistake of waking him up. My gilded cage was designed for complacency, not for war. Every corner was monitored, every interaction logged. The staff were polite but firm, their kindness a veneer over the unyielding steel of their authority. They were my children's employees, nothing more. To fight back, I couldn't be Elias Vance, the titan of industry. I had to become a ghost, invisible, underestimated. I started by playing the part they had assigned me. I became the senile, grieving patriarch. I feigned confusion, spoke in non sequiturs, and stared blankly at the television for hours. I made myself so pathetic, so utterly broken, that the staff's vigilance softened into pity. My weekly check-ins with the facility's doctor became shorter, my children's visits more perfunctory. I was fading into the floral wallpaper, just as they'd planned. But in the quiet of my room, late at night, the old Elias Vance, the one who built skyscrapers from dirt and dreams, was wide awake. I began to study my environment with the same intensity one once used to analyze a construction site. I mapped the nurses' schedules, the security guard patrols, the blind spots in the CCTV cameras. My greatest asset, I soon realized, was a young night nurse named Maria. She was in her early 20s, working 2 jobs to put herself through school, and she was treated poorly by the head matron, who seemed to take a sadistic pleasure in piling on the worst shifts. Maria had fire in her eyes, a quiet defiance that reminded me of Eleanor. I saw an ally. I started small. I'd leave her a $5 bill folded neatly on my nightstand after she'd done a small kindness, pretending it was a moment of confused generosity. Then, one night, I engaged her in a brief, lucid conversation about her textbooks. I saw the surprise in her eyes before she masked it. The next week, I accidentally let slip that I knew a professor at her university. I was laying a foundation, brick by brick, building trust. Finally, the night came. I waited until she was on her shift and feigned a fall. As she helped me up, I pressed a tightly folded note into her hand, my eyes pleading. Please, I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. This is a matter of life and death. My children are trying to kill me. It was a lie, a dramatic flourish, but it was the kind of lie a frightened old man might tell. The note contained a single name and a phone number, written on a scrap of paper I'd torn from a magazine. It was a name no one in my family had heard in over 30 years, Roman the Badger Kaczynski. Roman had been my first ever foreman, a tough-as-nails Polish immigrant who could smell a structural weakness or a liar from a mile away. We'd built the foundations of Vance Holdings together in the mud and the rebar. He'd retired 2 decades ago to a quiet life in the Catskills, but I knew his loyalty was to me, not to the polished, corporate version of the company my children now ran. Maria hesitated for a full day. I could see the conflict warring in her face every time she passed my room. The next night, she slipped a small, cheap burner phone under my pillow. "You have one call," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Then I get rid of it. I can't lose this job." I nodded, my heart pounding with a feeling I hadn't felt in years, hope. I waited until 3 a.m., when the facility was at its quietest, and dialed the number from memory. It rang twice. A gruff, sleepy voice answered. "Who is this?" "Roman," I said, my own voice unfamiliar to me. "It's Elias. I'm calling in a marker." There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of a man sitting up in bed. "Elias Vance? I'll be damned. I thought you were dead." "Not yet," I said, a grim smile touching my lips for the first time in months. "But I've been buried alive. And I need you to help me dig my way out." Roman arrived at the Willows 3 days later, disguised as a long-lost cousin from the old country. He was thicker in the middle and his hair was snow white, but his eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, and utterly unimpressed by the world. He played his part perfectly, shuffling in with a cheap bouquet of flowers and speaking in a broken English that was just convincing enough. We sat in the sunroom, surrounded by my fellow inmates, and while he spoke loudly about fictitious relatives in Warsaw, he slipped me a tiny listening device and a new, smaller burner phone. "The old place is a mess, Elias," he murmured, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Your boy Richard is a peacock. Strutting around, making deals he doesn't understand. He's leveraging the company's assets on a new high-rise in Jersey City, the Vance Pinnacle. He's using a new, cheaper supplier for the structural steel. Cutting corners to make the numbers look good." My blood ran cold. I knew the supplier. I had blacklisted them 20 years ago for using inferior-grade steel. To use them on a 50-story building wasn't just cutting a corner, it was building a tomb. Richard wasn't just arrogant, he was reckless. Caroline, Roman explained, had been appointed chief financial officer. She was a ghost in the machine, quietly rerouting funds through a web of shell corporations. It was a sophisticated system, but sloppy. She was getting greedy, leaving a faint but traceable digital trail. And Michael? He was in charge of public relations, his main job being to release glowing press statements about Richard's genius while ensuring the family's narrative about my sad decline remained firmly in place. They were a three-headed monster, and they were devouring my life's work. My instructions to Roman were precise. I was a builder. I knew that the strongest structures could be brought down by attacking their weakest points. Our first target would be Richard. "I need the original blueprints for the Pinnacle," I told Roman. "And the revised plans from Richard's new architect. I also need the name of the lead inspector on that project. The real one, not the one on the public paperwork." Men like Richard always believed they were the smartest people in the room. They didn't build loyalty, they bought it. And bought loyalty is a fickle thing. Roman, using old contacts from the construction unions, got what I needed within a week. The files were uploaded to a secure cloud server, which I accessed late at night on a tablet Maria had smuggled in for me. Poring over the schematics, I felt a spark of my old self return. My mind, which my children had deemed diminished, was as sharp as ever. I saw it immediately. A fatal design flaw. To accommodate a larger penthouse suite for a potential buyer, Richard's architect had altered the load-bearing columns on the top 3 floors. Combined with the inferior steel, it wasn't a risk, it was a certainty. The building wouldn't collapse tomorrow, but it would suffer catastrophic structural failure within a decade. It was a ticking time bomb, and Richard was selling it as a masterpiece. Next, Caroline. Her greed was her weakness. I directed Roman to an old, forgotten company account I had set up decades ago in Panama, a rainy day fund she couldn't possibly know about. He was to make a series of small, anonymous deposits into one of her shell accounts, just enough to trigger an IRS flag for unsourced foreign income. We were planting a seed. The IRS moves slowly, but they are relentless. All I needed was to point them in the right direction. The final piece was more personal. I knew that in the main safe at the Greenwich House, behind a portrait of my late father, was a set of private ledgers from my early days. They weren't illegal, but they detailed handshake deals, cash payments, and favors owed to me by some of the most powerful men in the tri-state area, men who were now pillars of the community. Getting those ledgers would be my key to true freedom. Roman's final task was the most dangerous. He had to break into my house, my fortress, which was now occupied by the enemy. He just smiled. "Don't you worry, Elias," he said, his eyes glinting. "The badger knows how to get into a chicken coop." The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare, orchestrated from a floral armchair. While my children saw a docile old man drooling in front of the television, I was a general commanding a silent army of 2. Roman, with the agility of a man half his age, successfully retrieved the ledgers from the safe. He sent me pictures of every page. Seeing the familiar scrawl, the names and numbers, was like rediscovering a lost part of my own soul. These ledgers were a map of my power, a power my children had no idea I still possessed. The first call was to a man named Dominic Valenti, a real estate mogul who now owned half of Brooklyn. 40 years ago, he was a struggling contractor, and I had personally co-signed a loan that saved him from bankruptcy. He owed me. I didn't have to threaten him. From my burner phone, my voice was calm and steady. "Dominic," I said. "It's Elias Vance. I understand you're on the zoning board for Jersey City. I have some concerns about the structural integrity of the new Vance Pinnacle. I'm sending you a file. I think you'll find it very troubling." The silence on the other end was heavy. He knew this wasn't a friendly tip. It was a debt being called in. Within 48 hours, an anonymous tip triggered a surprise, top-to-bottom safety inspection of Richard's pet project. All work was halted indefinitely, pending a full review. The media got wind of it, and suddenly, the Vance Pinnacle went from being Richard's crowning achievement to his public nightmare. Richard, arrogant and panicked, tried to bribe the chief inspector. The very man I knew from my ledgers was stubbornly incorruptible. The bribe was refused and, more importantly, officially reported. The first crack in their empire appeared. Next, I made my move against Caroline. The IRS flag we'd planted had, as expected, triggered a low-level audit. Caroline, believing herself untouchable, submitted falsified documents to cover her tracks. This was the trap. I had Roman leak a second set of documents, the real ones, showing the flow of money from Vance Holdings into her shell accounts, to a specific, notoriously ambitious agent at the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. The leak was accompanied by a note suggesting she look closely at the discrepancies. It was like throwing a match into a room full of gasoline. The audit instantly escalated into a full-blown criminal investigation. The final piece was my own freedom. My children had built my prison out of legal paper. I would tear it down the same way. Roman hired a discreet but brilliant psychiatrist from Boston, a woman with a reputation for being an unshakable expert witness. He paid her with cash from my Panamanian account. She visited me at the Willows under the guise of being a family friend. We spoke for hours over 3 separate visits. I told her everything about Eleanor, the grief, my children's betrayal, and the intricate plan I was now executing. I laid out the blueprints, the financial records, the whole war. She listened, her expression unreadable. At the end of our third meeting, she closed her notebook and looked at me. "Mr. Vance," she said. "Grief is not incompetence. And in my professional opinion, your cognitive and strategic faculties are not just sound, they are formidable." She filed her report the next day with the court, petitioning for an immediate reversal of my children's power of attorney on the grounds that it was obtained under false pretenses and through elder abuse. A hearing was set. The war was about to move from the shadows into the light. My children had no idea what was coming. They were so busy trying to plug the leaks in their sinking ship that they never once thought to look down and see who was drilling the holes in the hull. The day of the board meeting was a symphony of destruction, and I was its conductor. Richard had called an emergency meeting of the Vance Holdings board to quell the rumors about the Pinnacle project and to finalize a desperate, leveraged merger that was his only hope of saving face. He intended to project strength, to show everyone he was in control. It was the perfect stage for his downfall. An hour before the meeting, my lawyer, a new one, a shark hired by Roman, filed the psychiatrist's report and a motion for an emergency injunction to freeze all company assets pending the competency hearing. The trap was set. I walked out of the Willows that morning. The staff, so used to my shuffling, senile act, barely noticed as I strode out the front door, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit Roman had delivered the night before. A black car was waiting for me. For the first time in almost a year, I felt the sun on my face not as a patient, but as a free man. I walked into the Vance Holdings boardroom at precisely 10 a.m. The room was on the 40th floor of the first skyscraper I ever built, my name still etched in the lobby. My children were all there, Richard at the head of the table, flanked by Caroline and Michael. When they saw me, their faces went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, first shock, then confusion, then pure, undiluted panic. Richard was the first to speak, his voice a strained attempt at authority. "Father? What are you doing here? You should be back where you left me?" I said, my voice resonating with a power they hadn't heard in years. I let my gaze sweep across the stunned faces of the board members. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. My children seem to be under the impression that I have retired. I am here to inform you that I have not." At that exact moment, as if on cue, the large television screen on the wall, which Richard had been preparing for his presentation, flickered. It wasn't his merger proposal that appeared. It was the breaking news banner from CNBC. Vance Holdings CEO Richard Vance implicated in bribery scandal, Pinnacle project halted indefinitely. Richard's face turned the color of ash. He stared at the screen, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Before he could form a word, Caroline's phone buzzed violently on the table. She looked down, and all color drained from her face. She looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. "The IRS," she whispered, so faintly only I could hear. "They're freezing my accounts." Then came the final act. The doors to the boardroom swung open. It wasn't a secretary. It was two plainclothes detectives from the Greenwich Police Department and two stern-faced agents from the IRS. One of the detectives addressed Richard directly. "Richard Vance, you're wanted for questioning regarding the bribery of a public official." The other turned to Caroline. "Caroline Vance? We have a warrant to seize all personal and corporate financial records related to your position as CFO." All eyes were on me. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a single threat. I had simply presented them with the consequences of their own actions. Michael, weak and terrified, finally broke. He pointed a trembling finger at Richard and Caroline. "It was their idea," he cried. "I just went along with it. It was all them." I looked at my three children, the peacock, the viper, and the coward, as their world crumbled around them, broadcast live on the faces of the most powerful people in their industry. I had given them every advantage, every opportunity. They had taken my love, my trust, and my legacy and tried to bury me with it. So I simply handed them the shovels. I stood by the window in the library of my Greenwich home, the same room where my humiliation had begun. The house was quiet now, the silence a heavy blanket. The long legal battles were over. My competency was restored without question, the power of attorney declared fraudulent. Richard was facing federal charges, his career and reputation incinerated on the pyre of his own arrogance. Caroline, facing years in prison for tax evasion and embezzlement, had taken a plea deal, turning on her own brother in exchange for a lighter sentence. She would be a pariah for the rest of her life. Michael, having testified against both his siblings, was left with nothing, no inheritance, no respect, no family. He was an exile of his own making, adrift in a world he was never equipped to navigate on his own. Vance Holdings was a shell of what it once was, its stock worthless, its projects mired in lawsuits and scandal. I had spent a lifetime building it, and it took me less than a year to tear it down. The cost of their betrayal was the destruction of everything I had ever made. I had won. But standing there, alone in the echoing quiet, the victory tasted like ash. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and walked over to the grand fireplace, looking up at the portrait of Eleanor that hung above it. Her painted eyes were kind, and for a moment, I allowed myself to wonder what she would have thought of the man I had become, a father who had orchestrated the ruin of his own children. The rage had been a fire that kept me warm in the cold, but now that the war was over, all that was left were the embers and the bone-deep chill of loneliness. They had forgotten that the same hands that build a legacy can just as easily dig a grave. The end.